She kept the pot low and the lid barely cracked, and you knew without being told that supper was handled. That kitchen worked fast, one burner, one vessel, 10 minutes, and all of it went quiet when she did. Here are 30 easy one-pot suppers for black seniors who missed the 60s. Salmon croquettes were the one supper she could throw together between walking in the door and the 6 o'clock news signing off. A can of pink salmon, bones mashed right in for calcium because nothing left that bowl, mixed with a beaten egg, crushed saltines, diced onion, and a spoonful of yellow mustard, then shaped into patties and laid into a skillet of hot oil that popped the moment they hit. The trick was the leftover cold mashed potato she sometimes folded in as the binder when crackers ran short. A Depression-era substitution that black home cooks carried north through the Great Migration and never bothered to explain to anyone who didn't already know. She flipped them once, just once, and the side was always creamed English peas from a can, warmed in the same skillet after the croquettes came out. The whole thing was on the table in 12 minutes. You could follow every step exactly and still produce something that tasted almost right, but never quite right, because the missing ingredient wasn't in the recipe, it was in the hands that made it. Tomato gravy over rice was what happened on the nights when the money was thinner than the pot. A can of whole tomatoes crushed by hand, she never used a knife for that, dropped into bacon drippings with diced onion and a pinch of sugar to cut the acid, simmered until the tomatoes broke down into something thick and brick red and alive with fat. Spooned over a mound of white rice, done in 15 minutes, filling the plate like something that had taken all afternoon. What the rest of the country didn't understand was that this dish had roots older than anyone in that kitchen. Stewed tomatoes and rice traveled a direct line back to West African jollof traditions carried by enslaved people into the Gula Geechee coastal kitchens of South Carolina and Georgia and spread inland with every generation that moved. She never called it jollof, she called it supper. The taste was the same. Franks and beans was a Tuesday night staple that nobody put on a menu but everybody ate. A package of frankfurters sliced on the diagonal, dropped into a pot of navy beans that had soaked overnight or come out of a can if the week was rough, seasoned with onion, ketchup, mustard, and enough black pepper to make it mean something. The whole thing bubbled together in one pot for 10 minutes while cornbread crisped in the skillet alongside. It wasn't restaurant food, it wasn't church food, it was Monday's paycheck stretched to cover Thursday's table, and in African-American urban households from Chicago's South Side to Harlem's tenements, this combination fed families through the 1950s and 60s without requiring a single apology. You ate it fast and you ate it quiet. Second helpings were not guaranteed. Stewed tomatoes and okra came together in one cast iron skillet in less time than it took to set the table. Fresh or canned tomatoes went in first with diced onion and a little bacon grease. Then sliced okra, cut thick, never thin, because thin sliced okra disintegrates and the elders knew the difference. Added in the last 8 minutes so it stayed toothsome and didn't turn to mush. Salt, pepper, and a pinch of cayenne. That was it. Served over white rice, this dish had West African ancestry that predated the American South by centuries. Okra arrived in the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade, carried by enslaved West Africans who understood it as a staple crop and a natural thickener, and it planted itself in Gula, Creole, and Deep South kitchens where it never left. She didn't need a reason to make it. The okra was in season. That was reason enough. Before the slow cooker arrived to pretend it had invented one-pot cooking, your grandmother was already doing this with a Dutch oven and a gas flame set to medium-low. Potted chicken with rice meant bone-in chicken pieces. Thighs and drumsticks, Never breast, because breast meat goes dry and she didn't raise anyone who wasted money on dry chicken. Seasoned with salt, pepper, garlic powder, and paprika, browned in a little oil until the skin went gold, then set aside while diced onion and bell pepper softened in the same pot. The rice went in dry, stirred once in the drippings to coat every grain, then the chicken went back on top, and just enough water or broth poured over to cover. The lid went on, the heat dropped. 8 minutes in, and the kitchen smelled like Sunday. She learned this method from her own mother, who had learned it in a kitchen where measuring cups didn't exist, and the only instruction was to watch until it looked right. Nobody in that house asked what was for supper twice. That pot answered every question before you finished asking it. Skillet pork and sweet potatoes was the kind of supper that turned two cheap ingredients into something that looked and tasted deliberate. Pork shoulder pieces or country-style ribs cut into chunks and browned in lard until the edges crisped, then sweet potatoes peeled and diced into the same skillet, cubes small so they'd cook fast, with a splash of water to steam everything through, a lid dropped on, and the heat kept at medium for 12 minutes until the potatoes were fork tender and had soaked up every bit of pork fat in the pan. The combination was older than the skillet itself. West African food traditions paired yams and pork centuries before the American South claimed the combination as its own, and the sweet potato, botanically distinct from the yam but occupying the same cultural space in black kitchens, brought natural sweetness that needed no sugar added. A little hot sauce on the side, maybe a wedge of cornbread if there was time. Done. Lima bean and smoked meat stew was the supper that smelled like it had been cooking since morning, even when she hadn't started it until 5. A smoked neck bone or a single ham hock piece dropped into a pot of canned lima beans. She kept 6 cans in the pantry at all times because life was uncertain. With diced onion, a bay leaf, and enough water to cover, then brought to a boil and simmered hard for 20 minutes while the smoke from the bone dissolved into the broth. The beans went creamy without being broken, thick without being pasty, and the potlikker left behind was something you didn't pour down the drain. You sopped it with bread. You crumbled cornbread into it. Lima beans had their own deep history in black kitchens. Introduced to the Americas through indigenous and African agricultural exchange, they were a pantry staple long before the Great Migration carried them north into Chicago and Detroit apartments where a single can could anchor a whole meal. Sardines and hot rice was the supper that fed a family when the week had nothing left. A flat tin of sardines in tomato sauce, not oil, always tomato sauce, because the sauce was part of the dish, stirred directly into just cooked white rice with diced onion and a shake of hot sauce, heated 3 minutes until the fish broke apart into the grains. Done before the rice cooled. Canned sardines cost almost nothing, required no refrigeration, and delivered more protein per penny than nearly any other item on the grocery shelf, which is exactly why this Great Depression staple followed black families north through the Great Migration without losing a step. Some households added a sliced hard-boiled egg on top. She added pepper and a prayer of thanks and called it ready. The kids ate every grain. Mustard greens and potlikker was one of those suppers where the broth was more important than anything solid in the pot. A piece of fatback or a smoked neck bone went into the pot first with water and onion, brought to a boil until the fat rendered and the water turned gold. Then a full mess of mustard greens, washed 3 times because grit in greens is a character flaw, stripped from their stems and torn, went in and cooked down hard for 15 to 20 minutes. Mustard greens cooked faster than collards, which was the whole point on a weeknight when nobody had time for a 2-hour simmer. The potlikker that resulted was thick with minerals and fat and so deeply flavored that the real supper was what you drank, not what you chewed. You poured it over cornbread in a bowl, you sipped it straight. Some elders drank it as medicine, and they weren't wrong. Potlikker carried iron, calcium, and vitamins that kept undernourished communities nourished when nothing else could. There was a kind of supper that didn't announce itself. No single dish you could point to, just two things cooking side by side that together made a meal. Hot water cornbread, rounds pressed by hand from cornmeal, salt, and boiling water, laid into a cast iron skillet in a slick of hot grease and fried until they developed a crust you could tap with your finger. On the other eye of the stove, a pot of field peas with a smoked ham hock, cooked until the peas went soft and the broth turned silky. Together they were supper. The cornbread was for sopping. The field peas were for filling. She made it without measuring the cornmeal or timing the peas, because the hands knew the proportions and the eyes knew when the peas were done. The last time that supper appeared on this earth with all its authority was the last time those hands were in that kitchen. Chicken and rice with onion gravy was the dish that made a Tuesday feel like Sunday without asking anything extra of the week. Bone-in chicken thighs, browned in a cast iron skillet until the skin blistered, removed while thick sliced onions went into the drippings and cooked until they softened and went translucent and sweet. Then a splash of broth and a spoon of flour stirred in to thicken everything into gravy. The raw rice went in dry, stirred into the gravy so every grain turned tan. Then the chicken pieces laid back on top, a lid put on, and the whole thing left to steam over low heat for 15 minutes. What came out was rice saturated all the way through with chicken fat and onion gravy, the chicken fall apart tender and releasing whatever was left in the bone right into the pot. It was a Sunday caliber dish made on a Tuesday by a woman who understood that the technique was the recipe, not the clock. She is gone. The dish survives her, though it never tastes quite the same. Stewed neck bones and potatoes asked for. Almost nothing in the way of ingredients and delivered everything in the way of flavor. Pork neck bones, the cut the butcher once practically gave away, seasoned with salt, pepper, garlic, and a pinch of cayenne, browned in a Dutch oven until the exposed meat took color, then covered with water and a diced onion and left to simmer for 30 minutes until the bones began releasing their collagen into the broth. Cubed potatoes went in the last 15 minutes, soaking up the pork-rich liquid until they turned soft and silky and tasted of nothing that grew in the ground and everything that came from the pot. What the bones left behind wasn't just broth, it was a gelatinous, deeply flavored liquid that thickened as it cooled, and the neck bones themselves gave up their meat at the touch of a fork, falling in threads so tender you forgot the cut had once been considered waste. Black-eyed peas and pigtails was the supper that arrived on the table with a history most people in that kitchen had stopped talking about out loud. Pigtails, the cut nobody counted when they divided up the animal, dropped into a pot of dried black-eyed peas that had soaked overnight with water to cover, a diced onion, and enough time on the stove to let the tails render their fat and their smoke into every bean in the pot. The peas went velvety. The broth went dark and rich. The pigtail meat pulled away from the bone in bits too small to serve alone, but too flavorful to waste. This combination of beans and preserved pork reached back centuries before American kitchens. West African foodways had been pairing legumes with smoked or salted pork for generations, and the black-eyed pea itself traveled from West Africa to the Americas through the slave trade, landing first in the Caribbean before taking root in the South. You didn't make it just on New Year's. You made it when the week required something that stuck. Macaroni and tomatoes was the dish that proved you didn't need an oven to put something serious on the table. Elbow macaroni cooked 8 minutes, drained, then returned to the same pot with a can of diced tomatoes, juice and all, a thick pat of butter, diced onion, salt and black pepper, stirred over low heat until the tomatoes and butter made a sauce and the macaroni soaked it up. One pot, 15 minutes, nothing left on the plate. This was not baked mac and cheese. This was something older and quieter. A one-pot staple in African American homes throughout the 1950s and 60s, when a can of tomatoes cost a dime and a box of elbows cost a nickel, and together they could silence a table full of hungry children. The simplest version had 4 ingredients. She still made it better than anyone who tried to copy her, even when they had the same 4 ingredients in the same pot. Dry saltfish and white potatoes was the supper that arrived in black kitchens. Through a migration older than the Great Migration, carried first through the Caribbean trade routes and the Atlantic coastline by black communities whose fishing and preservation traditions predated the Civil War. The saltfish had to soak overnight, changed twice, because if you rushed that step, you got something closer to ocean water than food. After soaking, the fish broke into flakes and went into a pot with cubed white potatoes, sliced onion, a little oil, and just enough water to steam through. Salt, pepper, and sometimes a Scotch bonnet if someone had thought ahead. 20 minutes and the potatoes were soft, the fish was tender, and the briny depth that salt preservation created, a flavor you couldn't fake with fresh fish, had seasoned everything in the pot. In Gullah Geechee communities along the South Carolina and Georgia coasts, salted and dried fish had been a staple since before emancipation. The dish carried that coastline north. Nobody talks about crackling bread anymore, and that is exactly the point. Cracklings, fried pork skin, and fat left from rendering lard were folded directly into cornmeal batter and cooked in a cast iron skillet, the fat from the cracklings melting back into the bread as it crisped, richer than anything you could buy. While it cooked on one eye of the stove, a pot of butter beans simmered on the other with a smoked ham hock and enough water to make a broth worth drinking. The crackling bread was broken into pieces and dropped into the bean pot liquor at the table. That was the supper. If you grew up in a household that made cracklings after hog killing season, a fall tradition in rural black southern communities from the Carolinas to East Texas, you knew exactly when to expect this on the table. Nobody else would. Liver and rice with onion gravy was the supper that divided the table cleanly between the people who understood it and the people who had to be convinced. Chicken livers or a slab of beef liver, sliced thin because thick liver goes tough and she didn't make anything tough, dredged in seasoned flour and laid into a skillet of hot oil, cooked fast for 3 minutes aside until the outside took color while the inside stayed just past pink. Removed and kept warm while thick rings of onion went into the same skillet, softened in the drippings, then flour and broth stirred in and scraped until a gravy formed. The liver went back in. The whole thing was done in 15 minutes and served over white rice with the gravy poured across everything. Beef liver cost almost nothing per pound at the corner market in the 1960s, which is exactly why it appeared on so many weeknight tables, and exactly why it slipped off those tables as soon as the generation that stretched budgets passed on and left no one behind to defend it. Hominy and smoked sausage was one of those 1960s pantry suppers that some people remember and most people have stopped thinking about entirely. A can of hominy, white or yellow, drained and rinsed, dropped into a pot with sliced smoked sausage, browning in its own fat, then a can of diced tomatoes, a diced onion, and a pinch of red pepper flakes simmered together for 12 minutes until the hominy had absorbed the sausage fat and the tomatoes had broken down into a rough sauce. Done. Hominy itself had deep roots in indigenous food traditions. Dried corn treated with an alkaline solution through a process called nixtamalization, which unlocked nutrients unavailable in untreated corn and created a chewy, substantial grain unlike anything else in the pantry. African American kitchens in the Deep South adopted it generations before the 1960s, finding in it the same filling, economical, one-pot quality that made it useful when the week had more days than money. She kept 2 cans on the shelf at all times. You always knew the week was going sideways when both cans disappeared. Navy bean and fatback soup was the supper that the neighborhood could smell through the screen door from half a block away. Fatback, the pure salt-cured fat cut from the back of the pig with a strip of lean running through it, went into a pot of navy beans that had soaked since morning with water, diced onion, and a little black pepper, and cooked for 30 to 40 minutes until the beans went silky and the fat had completely dissolved into the broth, leaving only its flavor behind. The broth was salt porky and thick and so deeply seasoned that nothing needed to be added at the end. It was ladled hot over cornbread, crumbled in the bottom of a bowl, the bread soaking up the liquid and swelling into something between soup and porridge. Navy beans had been a Southern staple since the early 19th century, cheap and shelf-stable and capable of feeding a family of 8 from a single pound of dried beans that cost almost nothing. She kept a 5-pound bag in the cabinet. When the bag ran low, she bought another before it ran out. That was the rule. Chicken bog had been feeding South Carolina communities long before it arrived on anyone's weeknight table, born in the church fellowship halls and fish camp kitchens of the PD region, where a pot of rice, chicken, and smoked sausage could stretch to feed 50 people without anyone going hungry. A whole chicken simmered in a pot of seasoned water until the meat fell from the bone, the broth built from nothing but the bird itself. Then the chicken pulled and returned to the pot while raw rice went in to cook directly in the chicken broth, absorbing it all, becoming a thick porridge-like dish the locals called bog because the rice was too wet to call pilaf and too dry to call soup. By the 1960s, it had moved from church grounds into home kitchens across the PD, adapted for weeknights by grandmothers who added smoked sausage sliced into coins and reduced the simmer time by starting with bone-in thighs instead of a whole bird. She knew the technique from a woman who had learned it at a church fellowship hall in Marion County in 1944. That knowledge passed through exactly 2 pairs of hands. Pigeon peas and rice carried an entire diaspora in a single grain. The dish arrived in the American South through the Caribbean, specifically through the Gullah Geechee communities of coastal South Carolina and Georgia, whose trade and cultural ties to the Caribbean islands ran centuries deep. And in those kitchens, it was made the same way it had been made in Trinidad and Barbados and Jamaica, dried or canned pigeon peas, simmered with salt pork or a smoked piece of pork in enough water to cook the rice through. Everything going into the same pot, the rice absorbing the pork and pea broth until each grain was flavored all the way to its center. The pigeon pea itself, a legume with roots in West Africa, carried to the Caribbean through the slave trade and from the Caribbean to the American mainland, was the connective thread between continents, between islands, between the kitchens that came before and the kitchens that came after. She made it from memory. She had learned it from someone who crossed water to get here. Smothered turkey necks over rice was the supper that took the least glamorous cut of the bird and turned it into the most satisfying thing on the table. Turkey necks went into a Dutch oven with seasoned flour, browned on all sides until the exterior crisped and the foam built up on the bottom of the pot, then removed while diced onion and bell pepper softened in the drippings. Broth went in, the foam scraped up into the liquid, everything stirred into a thick gravy, and the turkey necks returned, submerged and covered. The heat dropped low for 45 minutes. What came out was meat so tender, it released from the bone at the touch of a fork, surrounded by a gravy so thick and dark it could stand a spoon upright, poured over white rice in a pool that the rice soaked up from the outside in. You didn't serve turkey necks to company, you served them to the people you loved enough not to perform for. That distinction mattered in those kitchens. It still matters to the ones who remember it. Catfish in tomato sauce was the supper that Mississippi Delta cooks had been making in one skillet long before anyone wrote it down. Catfish pieces, skin off, cut into chunks, seasoned with salt, pepper, garlic powder, and a little cayenne, then laid into a skillet where diced onion and bell pepper had softened in oil, a can of tomatoes poured over, the lid dropped on, and everything left to simmer for 12 minutes until the fish was flaky and the tomatoes had reduced into a sauce that clung to every piece. No breading, no frying, just the fish and the vegetables, and the pot doing the work. Catfish had been central to Black Southern foodways since before emancipation, pulled from the rivers of the Mississippi Delta and the Gulf Coast tributaries by Black fishermen who cleaned and sold them at market and kept the rest for home, and the tomato-based quick simmer was the weeknight version of a tradition that on Fridays became a full fish fry and on Sundays became something closer to a celebration. She made it on Wednesdays when she was tired and didn't want to hear any complaints about it. Beef tips and rice was the supper you made when you wanted something that felt substantial without spending the money that substantial usually costs. Inexpensive stew beef, browned hard in a Dutch oven until the fawn on the bottom went almost black, then diced onion, a splash of Worcestershire sauce, and enough water to cover, the lid clamped on, and the heat dropped low for 30 minutes until the beef went tender and the liquid became a thick gravy, poured over white rice, done. Worcestershire sauce had been a fixture in African-American kitchens since at least the 1940s, its anchovy, tamarind, and vinegar base adding a depth to braised meats that no single spice could replicate. She bought the large bottle. It was always nearly empty. Nobody talked about what went into the pot. They just knew dinner was ready when the smell hit the air. The Sunday ham bone never got thrown away. That was the first rule, and it didn't need to be written anywhere. If you grew up in one of these kitchens, you understood. The bone left from Sunday's ham was the seed money for Tuesday's supper. Dropped into a pot of dried butter beans that had soaked since morning with water, diced onion, and a bay leaf, the ham bone spent 40 minutes releasing everything it had left: marrow, smoke, salt, the last threads of meat clinging to the knuckle, into a broth that turned ivory-colored and thick and tasted of something that couldn't be purchased at any price. The beans went silky. The broth thickened until it coated the back of a spoon. Nothing was wasted. Wednesday's leftovers would be better still. That was the alchemy of these kitchens. A single ingredient doing its work across multiple days, feeding people twice over without asking anything more of the budget. She would be appalled to know that most people today throw the ham bone away. Chicken feet soup was the dish the rest of the world looked at sideways, and the people in these kitchens looked at with pure understanding. The feet, outer yellow skin blanched off, nails trimmed, went into a pot of water with white rice, diced onion, garlic, salt, and pepper, and simmered for 45 minutes until the collagen dissolved completely into the broth, turning it thick and glossy and almost gelatinous. The feet went fall apart tender. The rice swelled in that collagen-rich liquid and absorbed every bit of it. What health food companies now sell for $10 a cup as bone broth, these kitchens produce every week from the part of the chicken that cost almost nothing. You knew what to do with it. Somebody taught you. That person is likely gone now. The knowledge went quiet with them. Potted oxtail was the supper that rewarded patience with something close to luxury. Oxtail pieces, bone in, each cross-section ringed with fat and connective tissue that would, given time, dissolve into the braising liquid, seasoned with salt, pepper, garlic, and allspice, browned all over in a Dutch oven until the exterior went deep mahogany, then diced onion and a can of whole tomatoes crushed by hand and enough water to come halfway up the meat. The lid dropped on and the heat turned to its lowest setting. An hour and a half later, the meat had pulled from the bone and the braising liquid had reduced into a thick, dark gravy, so rich it barely needed the rice it was, served over. Allspice in the seasoning was the tell, a spice with deep Caribbean and West African connections, used in Jamaican oxtail stew and carried into African American kitchens through the same cultural currents that brought pigeon peas and saltfish north. She made it on evenings when she had nowhere to be. The whole house smelled of it for hours after the pot came off the stove. Turnip green pot with Potlikker rice was the supper that asked you to rethink what the word supper meant. The greens went in, turnip tops, stripped, washed, and torn, with a neck bone or a piece of fatback, enough water to cover, and a low flame held for 30 minutes until the greens went completely soft and dark, and the broth had turned deep green gold and tasted of both the earth the greens came from and the smoke of the meat that seasoned them. Then the rice, poured directly into the Potlikker and left to absorb it, every grain taken on the color and flavor of that broth until the pot became a single unified dish. Greens and rice together, eaten in bowls with a piece of cornbread, and silence, because there was nothing to say that the bowl hadn't already said. She made this in the last years of her life when standing too long was hard. One pot, one burner, everything she needed. Sweet potato and pork neck soup was a dish that carried West Africa inside it without advertising the fact. Pork neck bones browned in a heavy pot, then cubed sweet potatoes added with diced onion, a crushed garlic clove, salt, cayenne, and enough water to cover, brought to a boil and simmered 35 minutes until the sweet potato softened and began releasing its natural starch into the broth, thickening it, sweetening it against the salt of the pork. The combination of starchy tuber and braised pork in one pot arrived from West African culinary traditions where yam and pork stews had been common for centuries. The sweet potato substituting for the yam in American soil, but carrying the same structural role, the sweetness that balanced the salt, the starch that thickened the broth. She made this when the weather changed and the sweet potatoes came in. You could tell the season by what was on the stove. There was a pot on the back of her stove that was never fully empty. Not in the way a pot gets empty when you finish cooking. This one replenished itself, absorbed new things, gave back what it had taken in and more. A neck bone went in on Monday, leftover field peas on Tuesday evening, a wilting onion, 2 cloves of garlic, the greens that had been in the refrigerator a day too long. All of it went in because nothing left that kitchen that still had flavor to give. By Wednesday, the pot had become something nobody could name exactly, but everybody recognized. A broth that tasted of the whole week, of every meal that had come before it, of every scrap that had been too good to throw away and too small to serve alone. This was not a recipe. This was a philosophy. The understanding, bone deep in Black Southern cooking tradition, that waste was not an option, and that the pot was a living thing as long as you fed it. The pot went cold the day she did. Nobody has started it back up since. Long before snacks came in plastic wrappers, they came from the same pot that fed the family. Crackling bread was born on hog killing day, when families rendered lard from pork fat, and the crispy bits left behind, cracklings, were folded straight into cornbread batter. The cracklings gave the bread a crunch plain cornbread never had, little pockets of salt and pork fat that burst between your teeth. This wasn't something learned from a book. You stood next to whoever worked the stove, watching her crumble the cracklings with her fingers, judging the batter's thickness by sight. Through the 1940s and 50s in the rural South, hog killing meant every part of the animal fed somebody, and crackling bread was how the smallest scraps ended up on the table tasting richer than anything store-bought. Kids tore off corners still warm from the cast iron, eating it plain or crumbled into potlikker. The bread kept for days, growing denser with each one. Canned salmon cost almost nothing, and in the hands of a cook who knew what she was doing, it became something that tasted like it cost everything. Drained, picked clean of bones, mixed with crushed crackers or cornmeal, a beaten egg, chopped onion, and black pepper, shaped into patties by hand and fried in hot oil until each side went brown and the outside crackled when you touched it with a fork. The Florida Avenue Grill in Washington, D.C., one of the oldest continuously operating soul food restaurants in the world, served salmon cakes from its earliest days alongside collard greens and chitterlings. At home, they were a Tuesday staple, quick, filling, cheap, and good enough to make you forget they were any of those things. The cook knew when the oil was right not by temperature, but by sound, a steady, confident sizzle the moment the patty hit the pan. If it sputtered slow, the oil was cold. If it screamed, it was too hot. She knew the difference in her sleep, and she is gone now, and no one in that kitchen has made them since. Before lunch, money was a guarantee. Syrup sandwiches filled the gap between hunger and the next real meal. 2 slices of white bread, a heavy pour of Cairo syrup or dark cane syrup, pressed together and wrapped in wax paper for school. The bread went soft and sticky within minutes, part of the appeal for little hands that liked pulling it apart in sweet, doughy strings. In the 1950s, a bottle of Cairo cost less than 20 cents and stretched across a week of snacks for 3 or 4 kids. Dark syrup carried a caramel note with a faint bitterness that balanced the sweetness. Light was milder, preferred by the younger ones. No one bragged about eating syrup sandwiches. It was the kind of snack made quietly on afternoons when the icebox held nothing else. But decades later, grown men and women speak of it with something close to reverence, because that sandwich meant somebody made sure you didn't go without. Pinto beans and fatback was the dish that nobody bragged about and everybody loved. Dried beans, soaked overnight, started on the stove before anyone was fully awake, with a thick slab of fatback, salted, cured pork fat from the back of the hog, going in whole so its fat could slowly melt into the broth. Onion, garlic, a little black pepper, and 4 hours of low heat. The beans softened into something so deeply flavored that a bowl over white rice with a square of cornbread was all anyone needed. The secret was the salt. You never added it early because salt at the beginning toughens the bean skin and keeps the center hard. You waited until the beans had given in completely, until the broth had thickened on its own. Only then. Black mothers in the 1960s cooked by the look of the batter, the weight of flour in a cupped palm, the color of the roux as it darkened. A pinch meant something specific to her fingers. A splash of vanilla was always the same splash. She knew biscuit dough was right by how it pulled from her hands, and she knew rice had enough water by pressing her fingertip to the surface. This was mastery passed from mother to daughter through thousands of repetitions, a cooking language built on touch rather than numbers. The knowledge came from West African kitchens where written recipes never existed, carried through plantation houses where enslaved women fed dozens without a single instruction card. You learned by standing next to her, watching her hands, and when she died, no cookbook could teach you what she knew. The cinnamon sugar toast was the first snack most black kids learned to make alone, standing on a chair to reach the counter. The bread had to be white and soft enough to hold the butter without tearing. You spread it thick all the way to the edges because bare corners were unacceptable. Then came the cinnamon and sugar from a jar that lived next to the stove, the ratio known only to whoever filled it. The toast went under the broiler, never in a toaster, and you watched through the oven door until the sugar bubbled and the edges turned dark gold. You ate it standing up, burning your fingers, licking the grit off your thumb. It cost pennies, took 3 minutes, and the smell alone could pull every kid in the house out of hiding. Nobody sells it, nobody orders it, but that smell takes you straight back to a kitchen where the oven was always warm. She started them the night before, always the night before, because a deviled egg made the morning of a church supper was an egg with no character. Yolks came out and went through a fork, mixed with Duke's mayonnaise, yellow mustard, a little sweet pickle relish, paprika on top, and something else she never told anyone. Every cook had a something else, and knowing what it was meant, you were trusted enough to be taught. At every black gathering in the 1960s, church supper, family reunion, repast after a burial, deviled eggs appeared on the same church plate with the divots shaped just right, always gone before the main dishes were touched. There was an unspoken rule: you did not take the last one without checking that the person who made them had already eaten. She always made sure everyone else ate first anyway, and now the plate sits in a cabinet and no one remembers what she put in them to make them taste the way they did. Peanut butter and jelly on saltine crackers was what happened when the bread ran out, but hunger didn't. You spread peanut butter on one cracker, grape jelly on the other, pressed them together, and hoped it held. It rarely did. The saltine snapped under the weight, and you'd eat the whole thing in pieces, licking your fingers between bites. But the salt cut through the sweet jelly in a way soft bread never managed. In the 1960s, a box of saltines cost 15 cents and peanut butter ran about a quarter, making this one of the cheapest protein snacks a mother could stock. Kids ate these after school, before dinner, and sometimes instead of dinner when weeks ran long. Crackers stayed crisp for weeks. Peanut butter didn't need the icebox, and the jelly lasted until the jar was scraped clean with a spoon. Stewed tomatoes and okra was among the oldest dishes on the soul food table. Okra arrived in the Americas aboard slave ships. Enslaved African women hid the seeds in their braided hair on the Atlantic crossing, knowing they were carrying something they could not afford to lose. That act of preservation produced, generations later, a dish as honest as any in the Southern kitchen. Tomatoes, broken down in a wide skillet with sliced okra, onion, garlic, and bacon grease, cooked slow until the okra thickened everything into a glossy stew, served hot over white rice. Children in those kitchens learned that okra has two personalities, soft when stewed, crisp when fried, and the cook's job was to honor both. The stewed version is rarely made that way anymore, and there is no reason for that except that the women who made it right are gone. These kitchens fed generations on almost nothing and left a silence no cookbook fills. Drop a name in the comments. Somebody's grandmother deserves it.